Okay, good morning. One thing I want to make sure is if I have ordered stuff which is needed for different projects. So just want to check on that. So thus far I've ordered some drones, but you guys need to get back to me with information on gimbal. I ordered your router. I ordered the NVIDIA project related material. Anything else that I have missed? Okay. Um, oh, and I guess there is one other group which is doing the project with Bozang, which requires Oculus Rift. And that one, the problem is Oculus Rift is going to ship only in August. So I have a developer version from a few months old lying with me, which I'm going to hand to you guys. So its shipping date is August, so can't get it. Okay. Any other anything anyone else needs that I haven't mentioned? Okay. Um, so quite important because it takes around a week or so for these things to trickle in. So and particularly things are out of stock and all, then another problem. Okay. So continuing on where we left off last time, which is I started to talk about complications that arise when you have tasks interacting because they need access to a shared resource like a common radio or some other common hardware resource, or perhaps even a shared data structure. And the problem that comes up is that of priority inversion. And very intuitively, kind of the idea is that I have a high priority task which is ready to run but needs a resource. That resource was previously locked by a very low priority task. And then that low priority task got bumped off because there is some intermediate priority task. So now what in effect is happening is that this intermediate priority task can keep starving the low priority task. Whereas intuitively what we would like is that temporarily the low priority task, task 3 in the slide, which is holding on to that resource, should get high priority. So kind of intuitively what you would want to do is that if a task is locking a resource, then it should sort of get the priority of any high priority task which may also need that resource. So that's kind of the intuitive concept that one should go for. And I had mentioned this example on kind of one of the NASA missions where exactly something like this happened. And the problem with these kind of errors, these kind of bugs is that they're very hard to find out because they happen very rarely and they're very hard to replicate because the timing has to be just right for these things to trigger. Now, there's an alternative approach which hasn't quite reached level of maturity, whereas this whole area of computer science called formal verification. Anyone heard of it? And what that means? Okay, so kind of the idea behind formal verification approaches is that given a program, we make an assertion about it. For example, we say it will terminate within 10 seconds, or that it will never deadlock, or that the eventual value of a variable would be in this range. We make some assertion about its properties, and then using, without simulating it, using mathematical reasoning, we try to prove that this program indeed meets that thing. And it's an area which was it's an area which is firstly incredibly hard because imagine again you're not allowed to simulate because that's kind of defeats the purpose. You're mathematically trying to prove. So, but lots of progress has happened in recent couple of decades. That the state of the art now is that there are lots of properties about the function of a program that we can prove, but for small programs. But it's quite important because unlike simulation where you may test it on a large number of cases but you may still miss out, formal verification guarantees subject to whatever model and assumptions you have. So a lot of progress has made. So like you can prove properties like this pointer will never step out of a memory range and things like that. To the extent that there are now what are called as trusted operating systems, that is, operating systems whose code base has been formally verified. there's a version of Linux like that. Yale University has a whole project where kind of they have a operating system which is trusted this way. There is a language called Rust which has emerged again, which has properties which help you do that. Intel processors have extension called memory safety extension, which again help towards these. So there's a lot of progress there. The problem is when it comes to timing properties, the field is still very far behind. There is a mathematical framework called timed logic. So the idea is like logic assertions where time is also a variable. So like you might be able to say things like eventually this program would reach this value, or within a certain time some property will be met. But while a lot of progress has happened, things aren't quite there yet. So while for normal like value of a function, those kind of things, lots of progress has happened, and there are commercial tools. There's a company called Coverity, for example, which markets tools with people who write complex software apps kind of use. But when it comes to timing, these kind of things still don't exist. That is the subject of PhD thesis. So bottom line, kind of a hard problem. So what then happens is that you try to provide mechanisms which are a priori safe, in the sense encourage software designers to use mechanisms which are designed to be designed to have the right characteristic. Okay, so these are still slides on the same NASA problem, where basically kind of they patched once they realized what happened. Firstly, when the robot started misbehaving far away from Earth, they kind of dug into it, replicated it on the replica out here in JPL, figured it out, luckily for them, the OS they were using allowed them to patch all the semaphore and mutexes in one go, and they were able to save the robot. Problem basically it happened was, since it was so rare, and it got triggered under conditions that they didn't think it would occur. So even though they had seen it, they were not able to reproduce, and in the usual fashion, if something happens like that, you say, okay, it might be a hardware glitch, some noise will not happen, so it kind of got brushed under the rug. And the other thing is, this was kind of the part of the robot which was not critical, in the sense it was just collecting science data, but it was affecting the critical tasks because they were all running on a common processor under a common OS. Bottom line, we need to rethink how we can safely let tasks interact with each other, and in particular be able to make guarantees about meeting deadlines even when tasks are interacting with each other. So let's see how that can be done. So let's take a simple example. So what we have out here is 4 tasks, 4 processes or threads. They have the priorities that they have. So L4 is highest priority. What you see out here is a very simple execution model of that code. So the idea is 4th task is released at t equal to 4, at t equal to 0, the first task was released, so these are when they arrived. And task 4 needs to do the following. It needs to execute for a unit of time, then one more unit of time, then it needs a resource called Q. Then it needs a resource called V, and then again, so each letter, think of it as one time unit. And then again, it needs to do a normal execution. So to use the resource Q, it will lock Q, use it, release it. All of that happens in one time. Task 3 executes normally for 1 unit of time, then locks the resource, needs the resource V, uses it for 2 time units, and then T, and so on and so forth. Main thing to remember is that these are shared resources. So you see Q is also being used for 4 time units by task 1 down there, and V is being used by both L4 and L3. So what that means is that the protocol for usage would be, before you can use a resource, you have to lock it using a semaphore or a mutex, and then once you get the lock, then the task proceeds. So that's what we wish to do. So at t equal to 0, task 1 arrives. So let's see what the timeline would look like and what the problem happens. So Again, release time 0224. So at t equal to 0, task 1 arrived, started doing a normal execution for one time unit, then needed the resource queue. No one else was using the resource queue, so it went ahead and used the resource queue, which is this sort of top left to bottom right hashed thing. So it uses the resource for one time unit. And then tasks 3 and 2 arrived at t equal to 2. Task 3 is the highest priority, so it starts running and it gets does 1 unit of normal execution. If you see, task 3 is EVVE, so it runs for 1 unit of normal execution, then needs the resource V, which is free, so it occupies it. Then we are at, it runs for one time unit, and then we are at t equal to 4. At t equal to 4, the highest priority task came. It started running. It runs for 2 units of normal time. So now we are at t equal to 6, at which time it needs Q. Except Q is already locked by task 1. So this guy now enters the block queue. So it basically made some system call saying lock the semaphore, and it hangs on it. So at that stage, it cannot run, but remember the scheduler policy is that the highest priority task which is ready to run will get the CPU. So at this stage, task 3 is the highest priority ready to run task. All these 3 tasks are ready to run, 3, 2, and 1. 3 is highest priority, so it gets to run. It continues using V for one more time unit, then does the normal execution because it was going back EVVE. So it does all of that, releases a CPU at t equal to 8, at which time task 2 is the highest priority task. It runs, task 2 is simply EE, so it runs, and then at t equal to 10, finally, task 1 gets the CPU back. It goes through its execution making use of Q for 3 more time units, and at t equal to 13 is finally task 1 releases the resource, and the moment it releases a semaphore, immediately at that point the OS will give control back to L4, and then L4 will finish the call. So what you see out here is that L4 got blocked from t equal to 6 through t equal to 13 because it needed a resource. Task 1 had the resource, but also because of the interaction with priorities, task 3 and 2 also got to run. So what would we want in this situation? So what's the best we can do? Anyone? In a situation like this, what's the best, what's the minimum time and principal task for should block for? So right now we are blocking from 6 to 13, which is 7 time units. What do you think the best we could accomplish? Yeah.
3 units?
Huh?
3 time units?
3, or actually, I mean, in this particular example, 3, but in general, it could be as much as 4 if we just missed task 1, right? So the point is, we should not block for more than how so much time task 1 is blocking the resource for. Okay, so in this particular case, 3 units is what we would have wanted. And in general, with arbitrary times, we should not have task 4 blocked for more than 4 time units because of this interference. Now, this thing is different than what's happening out here is a different situation than what was happening when we were doing analysis previously about response time and all. In that case, we were worried about a task being bumped off by a higher priority task. But now we have to worry about a task being blocked by a lower priority task because of the shared resource phenomenon. So we would have preferred only 3 time units, but because of the way things worked out, we ended up also having to devote an extra 4 time units of blocking because of these 2 intermediate pairs. And intuitively, as you might imagine, somehow we need to have a mechanism so that the moment L4 got blocked, perhaps task 1 should get a higher priority. That's one option. Another option is that when task 1 needed the resource queue, perhaps right at that point in time, we should bump up its priority in anticipation to prevent the situation that L4 might get blocked. Okay, so we just, the moment you're using a resource which can also be needed by a high priority task, then you bump it up. So there can be a proactive approach and there could be a reactive approach. So, but what this slide is highlighting is a problem itself, which is a long time. And actually, in this particular case, it didn't happen. But let's imagine what may have also occurred is that while L1 was finishing through this critical period, maybe L3 could have arrived again, and then the process could have repeated, and actually L4 could have blocked for a long time to come, which is what began to happen on that Pathfinder example, which is frequencies were such that these intermediate tasks were coming frequently enough that basically the block time for the highest priority task increased quite a bit, and the robot began to reset again and again. So we want to somehow avoid this thing, okay? Um, so, this concept that I described, where we basically say, hey, let's make task one inherit the priority. That would be one possible plausible approach. So what can be done is that the moment task 4 at equal to says task 4 blocked, needing the resource Q, needing a resource Q, and so at that point in time, we immediately would bump up task 1's priority to be that of task 4's priority, something high, so that L3 and L2, instead of they getting the CPU at that stage, task 1 gets the CPU, it continues to run. When it finishes at equal to 9, this control reverts back to Q. Control reverts back to L4. So L4 does proceeds with that, finishes Q. Then what happens? Well, the problem is L3 had blocked V, or whatever. L3 had locked V. So same situation repeats again out here now. What's happening again at t equal to 10 is that task 4 needs V now, except V was previously blocked by L3. So again, we go through the same process where task 4 gets blocked, and therefore task control reverts back to the next high priority task. So task 3 runs, it finishes through V, and then only then we come out here. So in this case, what's happening is that once task 4 got bumped off because of Q, and once because of V. So we ended up getting blocked off twice. So again, it would be nice if this process doesn't happen again and again, because otherwise what may happen is that task 4 may repeatedly get bumped off if timing just happened to be unlucky, then for every shared resource it may get blocked once every time it uses a shared resource. So you would potentially like to avoid that as well. So because if you think about it, if we have to budget for this potential blocking, then that affects our schedulability, because that means I have to be prepared that in the worst case I may have an interference from a lower priority task, and therefore the promise I can make about L4 meeting its deadline has to be extremely conservative. So somehow we would like to make a better promise. But within the scheme, priority inheritance, this is how things will look like. So this is the same a variant of the analysis we had done previously. So if you recall, originally we had response time of a task is equal to compute time plus the interference it gets from high priority tasks. But now we also have an additional term, how much it can be blocked by a lower priority task. So, and somehow we need to come up with a formula for that. So expanding it, so for the ith task, response of the ith task, again ignore b sub I for the moment, it's compute time of ith task plus number of times a high priority task would have arrived and its compute time. So that we previously had. But now we need to add this term, the blocking time. And as we saw in this previous example, once for every resource it needs, we may end up blocking once. And each time we block, if we are unlucky, we may be blocked for the maximum time that resource is used by a lower priority task. So that gives us a handle on this. It basically says, if I have k shared resources, then for every shared resource, I'm going to block once. If that, I'm going to give a definition of usage, but in a moment. But intuitively, for every resource which I'm using and which someone lower is using, then I may get bumped off, I may get locked out. And the duration at which I'm going to be locked out is the duration for which the lower priority task may be using the resource for. Okay, so CSK is that term. So more formally, usage Ki is 1, resource K is used by some lower priority task, some task which priority is lower, and a task whose priority is equal to mine or higher than mine. Because I may also get bumped off because of this inheritance, because someone higher than me is using it. So take this example. If you look at L3, then what is happening is L3 is getting locked out during this period, 6 through 9, because the resource Q was used by L4 and by L1. So what's happening is L3 did not get a chance to run because it's being locked out because L1 temporarily inherited the priority. So we not only need to worry about resources that the task that I'm analyzing uses and someone else uses lower than that, but also resources which are used by a lower priority task and a higher priority task. I'm kind of sandwiched in the middle. So the definition of usage, therefore, is if resource K is used by a process or a task with priority lower than I, and another process or task with priority greater than or equal to I, then we need to worry about that resource, and the amount of time it can lock us out is CSK. Now, in this simple model, what the assumption is that every time a task needs a resource, kth resource, whichever task it is, they need it for the same amount of time. So maybe like it's a radio, and when the packet is being sent out, all packets are the same length, so whichever task uses it, it uses it for the same time. But that may not be the case. It could be that whenever one task uses the resource, it's for a shorter amount of time, another task uses it for a longer amount of time, in which case you just have to modify the formula and interpret CSK as the maximum time lower priority tasks may use it. So looking at this, back out here, this BI term basically adds all this overhead, and obviously it affects the response time. The response time now increases by this amount, and that in a way, what it means is that if I have shared resource, then my ability to meet deadlines is impacted, and somehow we need to improve this term. Okay, now we can never eliminate it because there is always the possibility that the high priority task comes at a time when some resource has already been locked, okay, or maybe just got locked. So I can never eliminate it, but perhaps I can improve this time. One problem looking at this is that right now we are locking once for every resource. Perhaps if we could modify it, and we'll see how to do it, one possible area of improvement is if we could eliminate locking multiple times. If we could just lock once, then that would help things. So this model, priority inheritance is okay in the sense that it is accounting for it, but it's doing it in a very conservative manner, and that's not a good that's not good for real timeliness. Another issue which comes up in this case is the situation of deadlocks, which is orthogonal to this, but we can run into it. Anyone knows what deadlocks mean in scheduling or operating systems, or like when we talk about processes? Like what does anyone seen? Like, okay, I see something.
There's like 4 conditions for it. There's like non-preemption, resource holding or something. But basically, there's 2 or more processes that are trying to get access to the same resource, and because of that, they can't grab a hold of the CPU at the same time. So the CPU ends up not running any of the tasks.
Okay, you're dancing around the problem, but not quite.
Yeah, kind of building off what he said. If there's one thread that holds a mutex right now, and another one is dependent on something it has to do, and it's dependent on something that has to do, then they're both just stuck waiting on each other.
Yeah. So okay. So to I think you're coming closer to it, but basically the notion is the following. Let's say there are 2 tasks. They both need resource A and B. Okay. So task 1 needs the resource in the order A, and then it will need B. Okay. So it will. So resources are used in a sandwiched manner. So kind of the idea is task 1 needs resource A, and then while holding resource A, needs resource B. And task 2 needs it in exactly the opposite order. Task 2 needs resource B first, and while holding on to B, then needs A. Okay? In many situations you can imagine there's some sort of a data structure or sometimes some hardware devices act in this manner. Now the problem that may happen is, if you're unlucky, task 1 may grab resource A and then get bumped off. Task 2 may have higher priority, so go ahead, lock resource B, and then needs resource A. Except that task 1 has already locked resource A. So now we are in a deadlock situation. Neither can proceed. There's nothing the system can do. Only thing you can imagine doing is to roll things back, which is not possible computationally. So we would like to avoid this situation. We would like to avoid the situation where I'm able to lock a resource which has the danger of resulting in a deadlock. Okay. Now this again, one strategy out here is we say, this is programmer's responsibility. They need to ensure that this would never happen. But the other approach is that could we again design our locking mechanism in a manner that deadlock is prevented. Okay, deadlock is another way of saying is that our deadline or response time goes to infinity. Okay, so things don't proceed. So somehow, so there are two issues that have come up, right? One is that we want to improve this blocking time because right now it's too high. Even if ith task is not using any resource, it is impacted by it because there might be resources which are used by tasks higher than I and lower than I. So this poor task takes a hit because of that. And the other thing is this whole possibility of a deadlock happening. So if you could design our resource sharing primitives in a manner that this is reduced, the blocking time, and deadlock is prevented, then we would be in terrific shape. So back in mid-90s, group out of CMU, they kind of proposed a concept called priority ceiling, which is pretty much the standard now, and it turns out to have nice properties. And then there are a couple of versions of it. I'll describe both of them, but the basic idea is the following: that now we begin to think as if resources, or more precisely the semaphores or the mutexes themselves, have priorities. So in particular, intuitively, before we go to specific schemes, let's say we have a binary semaphore S, so binary semaphore being one which we can lock unlock, so to enforce mutual exclusion. We say that this binary semaphore has a priority ceiling, and that priority ceiling is the highest priority of all the tasks which may potentially lock S. So if there is a radio, then its priority ceiling, or priority ceiling of the semaphore which associates with the radio, is going to be that all the tasks that may use it, the highest priority among those. And then intuitively, what we would like to do is the following: when a task attempts to enter a critical section, attempts to lock such a resource, then what we will do is we will suspend it unless the priority of that task is greater than priority of all the semaphores which are currently locked by tasks other than itself. Okay, so it's a mouthful out here, but let's parse it. So there's a task which needs a resource, but even if the resource is free, we want to be cautious because we see that we run into problem there. So what will happen is that the OS, instead of saying, hey, you need this resource, the resource is free, go ahead. Instead of that, what the operating system will do is it will say, okay, what is the priority of this task which needs a resource? And then what it will see is what other resources are already locked and what their priority ceilings were. And the idea is that if there is already some resource which is locked and its priority is higher, its priority ceiling is higher than the priority of this task, then there's a case of possible danger, because what has happened is that there exists this semaphore which is already locked, its priority is high, and therefore the danger is that if I go ahead and give this task tau the resource it needs, then later on, some other task may run into trouble. Okay, because the problem is that operating system doesn't know in what order a program is going to need the resources. So usually what happens is when a resource needs to be used, the best case scenario would be that you tell the operating system, I need access to all those semaphores. So upfront, you somehow specify that I need access to semaphore 1, 2, and 3. Okay, and let's say every process has specified it. What the OS doesn't know is the sequence in which you may need those resources. And more importantly, that those sequences may be a large number of patterns, and they may also vary over time. Okay, so it's impossible for the OS for us to even attempt to express to the OS. So the only information OS has is what resources this task may need, but it doesn't know what order it may need. So in our example that I had cited, if there were two resources, task A and B, and one task needed them in the order A, lock B, unlock A, and the other task needed it as lock B, lock A, unlock B, that pattern is not available to the OS. So OS cannot do an analysis to do it. So priority ceiling is a way to kind of be conservative about it. So what's happening therefore is that a task may ask for locking a semaphore. That semaphore may be free, that resource may be free, but if it turns out that there already is some other resource or some other semaphore which is already locked by some other task, and that semaphore has a higher enough priority, then we are not going to proceed. We are going to consider that there is a possible deadlock situation. We are not going to proceed to that. In that case, task will not enter the critical section. It will be put into the blocking queue, and what will happen is that the task which is currently holding to the semaphore which had the highest priority is the one which we will say is blocking me. Okay, so basically some other low priority task has locked the resource. Remember, that task has to be a low priority one, because if it was high priority, it would be the one running. So there is some low priority task in the system which had locked a high priority semaphore, and therefore we will be cautious, and we'll basically say tau will not proceed, and that lower priority task is blocking tau, and it will therefore get the priority of tau. So the idea is that lower priority task gets a bump up, it begins to run. So that's kind of the intuition. Let's see how the specific forms of the protocol work out. So there are two variants of it. And they're kind of both found. One is called original protocol, which was one out of CMU, and then later on there was a refinement called immediate one. Upshot is that with these mechanisms, several properties become true. Number one, a process can be blocked at most once by a lower priority process. So intuitively, going back out here, in this case, we had a sigma term because the process could be blocked multiple times, once for each resource. What we will see now is that we make a promise that a task can be blocked by a lower priority task at most once. So we'll see that the sigma gets replaced by max, which is a huge improvement. And the other thing is there are no deadlocks. We are being just super safe. Mutual exclusion is assured, and there's something called transitive blocking, which is A blocks B, B blocks C, C blocks D. So that kind of thing is also prevented in the chain. Don't worry about that detail, but main point is that all the desired properties kind of hold true. And the result of all of that is that we win on responsiveness, and we also win on safety. No deadlock, and we have a responsive system. So to give you an example of how this priority ceiling kind of works out in practice, so let's say there are two tasks. Both of them need access to a shared resource, which are protected by semaphore S1 and S2. And then what task 1 does is locks S1, then locks S2, then unlocks S2 and S1. So S2 is sandwiched inside S1, and task 2 is the other way around, and task 1 is the higher priority. So task 1 is the higher priority than task 2. priority ceiling, so both semaphores are being used by both of them, and therefore priority ceiling of both of those semaphores is going to be the priority of task 1. Okay? Now, what would happen in this case? So, we start out, task 2 arrived, task 2 began to run. Task 2 unlocks S2. Nothing preventing it because remember, there is no other semaphore which is currently locked, and S2 is available. So task 2 goes ahead and gets the S2. But then at t equal to 1, at t1, task 1 arrived. It's higher priority, so it begins to run. Task 1 runs for some time and now needs S1. Now this is where a normal operating system without this kind of priority ceiling thing would have said, hey, S1 is free, go ahead. But with the ceiling protocol, what happens is, at this stage, the OS will say, is there any other semaphore which is currently locked, whose priority ceiling is greater than equal to that of task 1? And indeed, S2 is locked, and S2's priority ceiling is greater than equal to that of tau 1. Therefore, at this point, even though S1 is free, the OS doesn't let task 1 proceed. Task 1 is blocked, put onto the block queue, and instead, task 2, which is holding on to S2 and therefore is blocking task 1, inherits the priority of task 1. And it will, in this case, it's a simple example, but let's say there were some other tasks that would have mattered. So task 2 begins to run, and then it will go through its whole cycle, and once it releases S2, at that point, things become safe for task 1 and it would have proceeded. If we hadn't done this, then we would have entered into a deadlock. So by doing this kind of a bit of a look ahead that is this move potentially dangerous, you sort of deal with this. By the way, this kind of priority ceiling is something that you will not if you're running with thread libraries in Java or C++ or these sort of languages, or pthreads in Linux, they have threads, they have semaphores, they have mutexes, but there's no protections against deadlock. All that you will see is your program hangs because their semaphores and mutexes are not designed to protect against these situations. But the mutexes and semaphores that you will find in operating systems like VxWorks, which is, as I mentioned, couple of more lectures ago, is one of the dominating RTOS around. They have these kind of features. So again, these kind of capabilities are found more in these kind of operating systems that are targeting things. The reason is because all of this additional tracking comes at a cost. You have to keep track of what are the resources, who has locked them. Actually, the other thing is somehow you need to tell the operating system upfront that you are going to need these resources. Normally, when we write programs, multi-threaded programs with semaphores and all, we create these resources whenever we feel like there is no particular declaration that is done. So just in general purpose OSs, we just don't design them that way. Okay, so that was a deadlock prevention idea. So let's see how one of the specific protocols works. So this is the original priority ceiling protocol, so-called original priority ceiling protocol. And there are minor differences in the way these things work. So in this case, what happens is, again, each process has a priority. Each resource has a priority ceiling defined for it, which is the maximum. So thus far the same as what we discussed. Then what happens is, in this particular case, each process has a dynamic priority that is the maximum of its own static priority, and any it inherits due to blocking higher priority processes. So this is what we described in the previous slide. Task 2's, tau 2's priority was dynamic, as in initially task 2's priority was low, but then at T2, since it is blocking task 1, its tau 2's priority changed to that of tau 1. So it was a dynamic priority. So a process has a dynamic priority, and then finally a process can lock a resource only if the dynamic priority of a process is higher than the ceiling of any currently locked resource. So if a process attempts to lock a resource, it will only be able to do it if the current priority of the process is more than that of any other process which is currently, any other resource that is currently locked. Upshot of all of this is deadlock is prevented, as we discussed earlier, but also that blocking turn now becomes a max. So we just need to consider the worst case shared resource, and that can happen because just at the moment we arrived, that particular resource happened to be locked by a lower priority task. So back to our original example of L1, L2, L3, L4. Um, this is what will happen. So L1 starts running, does a normal execution, locks Q. Nothing happens thus far. Then at t equal to 2, L3, task 3 and 4 arrive. Task 3 began to run. It has the current highest dynamic priority. At t equal to 3, what will happen is task 3 decides to use Q. Actually, was it Q? V, I forgot. Let me see. V. Okay. So task 3 decides to use V, and at that point the OS will check, is there any other semaphore which is currently locked whose priority is higher than that of 3? And indeed, Q is locked, and Q's priority ceiling is that of task 4. So at this stage, instead of L3 proceeding, L3 gets blocked, even though V is free, but L3 gets blocked. Next higher priority task is task 2 currently. That also is unable to run for the same reason. So at that stage, task 1 will run, and task 1's dynamic priority, because it is blocking L3 and L2, task 1's dynamic priority would be that of task 3. And therefore, it will, it will be that of the semaphore it's blocking, so it will begin to run. At it will be that of task 3. At t equal to 4, task 4 arrives. Task 4's priority is greater than any one of these, so therefore task 4 begins to run. Then at some stage it requests Q, but Q is already taken by task 1, so it gets blocked. Then task 1 gets priority of task 4, it runs, releases Q, L4 runs, and at that stage, if you see when task 4 needs the V, since L2 and L3 are locked, it continues to be. So in this case, as you can see, the block time for L4 was pretty small, whereas previously it was 7 time units. In this case, it's just 2 time units. In worst case, it could have been 4 time units. So this is how OCCP works: no deadlock and a much shorter block time, and it's kind of the same thing for others. So as you would intuitively expect, things are kind of finishing roughly in the order of their priorities, as we would expect in something like this. Task 4 is being blocked minimally, then task 3, then task 2, and finally this guy. So that's how OCCP works. There is the variant called ICCP, and the way it works is the following. Again, tasks have priority, resources have priority ceiling, and what happens is a process has a dynamic priority that is the maximum of its own static priority and the ceiling values of any resources it has locked. So the difference is, in this case, the dynamic priority is the maximum of its own priority and that of any process it is blocking, whereas in this case it is that of the resource it has locked. So the difference that would happen is, at t equal to at this point in time, at t equal to 1, the moment it locks a resource, it will get the high priority. So let's see how it plays out. In ICCP, what happens is that task 1 at t equal to 1 asks for the resource Q, and at that point in time, immediately its priority gets bumped up to that of priority ceiling of Q, which is 4. So therefore, when task 2 and 3 arrive, they don't get the CPU. Task 1 finishes to its completion. So the moment you grab a resource, the priority, you get the priority of the resource. And so in this particular case, task 1 gets the high priority immediately, and therefore it just immediately ends up using the resource, and not 1, 2, 3. So again, in one case, your priority immediately goes up the moment you lock a resource, whereas in the other case, your priority goes up to that of any task you are actually blocking, not that of the resource itself. The two have the same properties in the sense they both avoid deadlock, and they both reduce that blocking term to the max. What do you think might be a pro and cons of these two? Why are there two of these schemes? So what's the advantage of immediately jumping onto the high priority, the priority of the resource itself, as opposed to priority of whosoever you may actually be locking? So second scheme, moment I lock a resource, I immediately get the priority ceiling of that resource. That means any task, whatever high priority task may be using it. Whereas in the first case, when we lock the resource, if we are not blocking anyone, my priority remains unchanged. But if by moment I block the resource, moment I block another task, then I get that guy's priority.
So in the second scheme where you get the highest priority right away, maybe you have some very critical task that comes in that is requested right away that can be locked up and have the highest priority and be allowed to execute fully?
Actually, no. So while it may happen, in the worst case, we are not making, in either case, the blocking term is still the max. So it's not affecting our schedulability at all. It really has to do with ease of implementation and number of context switches, okay? So in this case, what's happening, in the first case, as you imagine, while I'm locking the resource, my priority may change multiple times. So whereas here, the moment I lock a resource, I just change the priority and be done with it. So the implication of that boils down to the following. Worst case behavior is identical. But in case of the second protocol, I don't have to worry about priorities changing multiple times and all. So it's a lot easier to take care of it, okay? In particular, I don't need to keep track of which process is blocking what resource. All I need to worry about is I need this resource has a priority, and be done with it. So the result is that ICCP leads to fewer sort of context switches, and that may have an implication on the overall system. Anyway, so with these, so if the operating system you have provides semaphores and mutexes but does not have priority ceiling type mechanisms, then you have to be careful, both to make sure that there is no possibility of deadlock, and the second thing you have to be careful about is that in your timing analysis, you have to realize that blocking term would actually be potentially a sigma and not a max. So that affects your schedulability. Both of these things one has to worry about. Whereas if you are working with an OS where there is priority ceiling, then you have to, then you can make use of it. There's always a cost to these things because now the semaphores are more complicated. So the OS overhead increases. So you're paying for it there, but you have a safer system. So even though I talked in terms of shared resource, semaphores, mutexes, but everything else, all other type of communication between systems, like one process sending a message to someone and all, they can all be thought in the same terms. I mean, if there is a queue, the queue is protected by a semaphore, I'm writing to the queue, the other process is reading from the queue, same concept. It's a hardware resource, a serial port, a radio, they all can be viewed in that basic framework. So anytime processes interact by virtue of sending a message to each other or by virtue of using a shared resource, it can all be modeled in terms of that I described. One thing which one has to be a little bit careful about is that this formula that I was presenting thus far, this guy, whatever, you know what I'm talking about, this formula and where it is being used. This is assuming that resource usage is not nested. What I mean by that is that if there is if I need or this resource which just takes into account any nesting. So in the examples I had that I lock A and then while I'm using A I lock B, then the critical section for A will have to include how much time I lock B for. So I lock the what would be a good example? I lock the radio and then I lock a buffer. Then my radio usage time, and then I release the buffer, and then I release the radio. Then when I talk about how much time I'm spending in the radio, I need to make sure that I also budget for the time I spent in the buffer. So one just has to be careful in these accounting. But the basic strategy remains the same. What else? One other issue when dealing real life issue that one has to deal with it is that a lot of time our systems are not perfectly periodic. So thus far our model was tasks are arriving periodically. What if they don't? Sometimes these are packets coming over a network or something coming from some hardware device. They're sort of periodic, but there is jitter in them. Okay, there is because of the delays in the system, they can sometimes arrive early, sometimes arrive late. So that jitter somehow one needs to factor in, and the way it happens is you can characterize the jitter by saying there is a baseline period, and then a task may arrive up to j earlier and up to j later. So the band plus minus j, and the way the equation gets modified is that you have to put this additive term out there, okay, to take care of the jitter. So that's if you can characterize the jitter, that becomes an easy way of deal with. Another issue which we haven't addressed thus far is what if thus far we had assumed that the deadline was either equal to period or less than period. What if the deadline is greater than period? So if deadline is greater than period, then what we're basically saying is I got a copy instance of a task, and the deadline by which I finish to it, it may happen that one or more additional instances of the task may arrive, and that's okay. So it could be that I tell you I'm going to send you a video sample every 30 millisecond, video frame every 30 millisecond, but for every frame you have a second to take care of it. So one issue that we had discussed with that situation was that your code has to be re-entrant, okay, because you may have multiple copies of your function simultaneously active. But the other issue is that we have to be careful in our deadline analysis. And there is actually a third issue. When we have a situation like this, D is greater than T, then there is no known optimum scheduling algorithm. So for deadline equal to T, rate monotonic was optimum. For deadline less than T, what was optimum? Anyone recalls? Deadline monotonic, exactly. But for deadline greater than T, there is no optimality result. So all you can do is you have to try every possible priority ordering. If I have n tasks, then I have to try all the possible factorial n permutations and see if whichever one of them succeeds. If I have 2 tasks, try both. So that's one important thing. There's no optimality result known. The second, I mean, you can probably weed out of some obvious situations there, but you have to do an exhaustive search. But the other very important part is that deadlines may be missed way out in the future. So let's see what may happen. Let's imagine I have 2 tasks. One arrives every 80 time units and it needs 28 units of CPU time, and the other arrives every 110 time units and it needs 71 units of CPU time. Okay, and let's assume for a moment that the deadlines are far out. Okay, so I just want to see how things can play out here. Okay, so and then we'll put a deadline back. So let's say we start at t equal to 0, and now let's imagine task 1. Let's assume task 1 is higher priority because we decided, hey, we've been talking about rate monotonic a lot. Rate monotonic is great. Let's apply that. Let's see what happens. So task 1 is higher priority. Task 2 is lower priority. So at t equal to 0, task, let's see, so a copy of task 2 has arrived and a copy of task 1 has arrived. Let's see when this copy of task 2 will finish. Well, what will happen is, since task 1 is higher priority, so going back out here, first 28 time units, this guy will keep getting. Then task 2 will get a chance to run, but it would only be able to run for 52 time units before another copy of task 1 arrives. And then it will run, and only then task 2 will get a chance to run. Upshot of all of this is that if I look at when the copy of task 1 which arrived at t equal to 0 finishes, it finishes at 127 time unit. Okay. At t equal to 127. But meanwhile, another copy of task 2 will have arrived at 110. And if we continue this simulation exercise, we will see it will finish at 226. But since it's finishing at 226, another copy of task 2 would have arrived at 220. So if you look at that, it finishes 353 and so on and so forth. And by subtracting completion time minus arrival time, I can see how much response time I was getting for each one of those copies. First copy had a response time of 127. Second copy had a response time of 116, 133, 122, 111, 128, and so on and so forth. Let's say I had told you that the deadline for task 2 was 128. Okay, then if you just looked at the first copy, you would have said, aha, it's less than 127 is less than 128, I'm good. But if you see copy number 3 actually misses the deadline. So what this suggests is that I have to look farther out. It may not be my first copy that may miss the deadline, but it might be something farther down the line. So this certainly makes our checking for deadline misses also much harder. Not only I have to try every priority order, but I also have to keep trying out into the future. And I have to keep trying until such time that the response time becomes less than the period, because at that point the system is back to being empty. During this time, the problem was there were multiple copies active at the same time. And in this case, for this final, for this last row, what happens is response time is 106, which is another way of saying is that the task arrived and the task finished before the next copy arrived because the period was 110. All these other numbers are greater than 110. So that means that by the time I finish, another copy arrives. But this last row is the first time I finished before the next copy arrived. So the approach intuitively becomes keep simulating until you either have a deadline miss, which for example for a deadline of 128, I will have a deadline miss in iteration number 3, or your response time becomes less than the period, in which case you have entered a safe phase again. So these kind of systems where there is a pipelining going on are harder to analyze for this purpose. Can you think of systems where I would have deadlines which are a lot more than the period? That is, latency that I need is much more than the inter-arrival time. So think about it this way: what factors of a system dictate the period, and what factors of the system affect the latency? So think of my example of video frames arriving, and I was talking in terms of so what is dictating? What factors of the system dictate how often a video frame arrives? Like how do we? I was using like in NTSC it is 30 milliseconds or something like that, 29 point some millisecond. Why is it that? What factor leads to a particular rate of data?
Our vision.
Huh?
Our vision.
Our vision, yeah. So it's the quality, or in case of other sensors, it is the ability for us to reconstruct Nyquist sampling or things like that, right? I mean, they affect what rate we are doing so that we are capturing adequate information. What affects the latency? what dictates the latency? And you guys are working with video from the thing. What do you think will affect the latency?
How long it takes to communicate maybe the video across or process some information about the video?
No. That affects the latency in the sense of uh, what the system is doing. But when I specify the system, I say latency should be this much. Where does that number arise from? What factors of our application or system lead us to specify a particular latency? So let's say I have a camera. Its video stream is undergoing some processing. There's an output coming out of it, and I'm going to specify some latency for it, which basically leads me to the deadline. What factor? Sorry if you were raising your hand. I didn't look. Yeah.
The processor algorithm to.
No. That is my ability to implement it. I'm talking about the specification. Huh? No, again, that is. You guys are thinking too much about the implementation already. I'm saying that someone specifies to you latency should be this much. Where are they picking that number from? What factors lead to that?
Maybe the delay for the next information coming, the next piece of data.
No, that's again the system. So okay. So latency is an artifact of human requirements. So let me clarify that. Let's say sticking to the video example, let's say the video example had to do with I was doing it as a teleoperation feedback loop. Okay, if the video processing delay was a lot, then my feedback loop would not work properly. Or if it was part of a two-way conversation, then again a long delay is going to cause perceptual problems, right? On the other hand, if it was simply a video stream being processed, dumped into a logger, and which I'll examine a year later, then latency requirements are going to be different, right? So latency requirements are an artifact of the surrounding application using it. Or another example, acoustic processing in your cell phone. If it is, lots of psychological studies have shown that two-way conversation becomes essentially impossible once the round-trip delay hits around half a second or so, okay? Because you are saying something and I'm going to be cutting you off because I thought you were silent, right? So latency requirements arise from perceptual issues, yeah.
So we're talking about the ceiling of the latency that we wanted to, so we're saying latency cannot be bigger than this?
No, so I'm basically saying that someone is, like when I am when I'm generating the specification of a system, what factors lead to a particular latency being specified and what factors lead to a particular rate being specified, and these are two different things. Rate arises from our ability to have adequate or correct information, Nyquist rate, and also I guess the other factor that Manoj mentioned, which is kind of the human perceptual, persistence of vision factor, right? Latency, on the other hand, is an orthogonal factor. I can have a system which is very high sample rate, but very relaxed latency, right? Data logger is a great example. Very high sample rate, but I don't need the data until much later. On the other hand, I also have systems where latency could be very tight because we are engaged in some sort of a loop, or maybe it's a robot and I want to make sure that by the time I get the sensor event, I don't hit something, right? I mean, so those could be factors. Or like in your example of your project, you guys, if I'm providing the user with this first person vision and all, I would bet if latency is a lot, and if there was some sort of a since I'm also trying to control, you're trying to control your UAV, you will run into problems. Your latency requirements are going to be tighter, otherwise you have a round trip kind of thing. Cellular phone, great example. Conversation becomes impossible if the delay becomes too much. Another aspect that dictates delay in many cases, like networks and all, is if delay is too high, system performance itself begins to suffer. Congestion control, TCP, begins to sort of have problems if delay is a lot or delay is varying a lot. So delays arise from different factors, and it certainly very easily possible that the application imposed requirements of delay are very relaxed and rate may be high. So in this case, I may certainly have the situation that I was describing, that the delay could be more than sort of what we are saying could happen. Now, there's a separate set of issues, which is if I have a single processor to implement the system that you have asked me to, then even if you gave me a delay which is more than the period, I really have no effective way of using that thing. I might as well think that the latency is equal to the period. And the reason is the following, that if you tell me latency is more than the period, then I would have something else piling on to that processor anyway. So a lot of times we implicitly see an assumption that latency is equal to the period simply because we are running on a single processor. But if we were designing our own hardware, or if we had multiple processors, then obviously you can make use of that. So latency and throughput, or latency and period, they are really orthogonal. They arrive from different considerations, and in a properly designed system, you can kind of make use of that. A very common thing that you see is in one-way type, like if I'm watching a movie or things like that, you see buffering takes place. Buffering increases latency, but that in a one-way movie watching experience, that's perfectly acceptable. But we run into problem when we have a remote or pause or something like that, then sometimes we start seeing problems in a network setting. So back out here, deadlines can be arbitrarily large, depending upon my application. They don't have to be equal to the period or less than the period. So this issue of large deadlines then basically says, hey, we cannot simply look at the first iteration. We have to go all the way down and then consider where my deadline miss is happening. So that leads to yet another modification of the baseline schedulability equation, where we basically say, now let's worry about which iteration number we are worrying about. So we start with q equal to 0. We look at the first iteration, but then we calculate the response time, and then we increase q. So what's happening out here is q is indicating the iteration number. So if I'm looking at qth iteration, then what would have happened is multiple copies of the ith task would have arrived, and therefore and q starts. So q equal to 0 means I have one copy. Q equal to 1 means I got two copies. So you see q plus 1 out here, and otherwise the equation is the same. So I need to run the task itself multiple times. So I calculate the response time for different values of q. I keep doing it until I get a response time which is less than the period, because at that point the system is back to square one. And then I see whether my maximum response time was better than the deadline that I need. So again, this becomes the arbitrary deadline case. So my full-blown equation, I think I'm missing a slide. Yeah, so you calculate the maximum response time and then be done with it. So the full-blown schedulability kind of looks something like the following, which has a jitter, which has the blocking term, which has multiple arbitrary deadlines. And the key thing to remember is that with arbitrary deadlines, we cannot assume that rate monotonic is the best. You have to just try with it. Final complication which comes into play and which has been more of an issue in recent years is what happens with power management when the processor starts being shut down when it is idle. So there may be times in which the processor has nothing to do, in which case we shut it down. Also, there are times when the processor can be slowed down. So all these things create additional complications. And to be able to account for that, one has to then account for something which we have ignored thus far. We kind of assumed that context switching was no cost. now we have to account for context switching. We also have to account for waking up the processor, putting the processor to sleep, changing its frequency, all those kind of factors. So the equation becomes more messy. I'm not going to go into that, but main point is that, again, over the past, in the recent 5 to 10 years, lots of work has happened where has extended meeting deadlines and all into conditions where power management is also being done, so that you can have low power and real timeliness sort of at the same time. Now, so one thing I would also say is that you don't need deadlines for every system necessarily. Many systems are merely fast. They are not, being fast is easy to handle. The part which makes things hard is when you have to make a promise about ability to meet a deadline and or to not suffer from deadlock. Deadlock is the extreme case of complete deadline miss because you have your response time goes to infinity. It would occur in systems where you have some sort of a control loop or some sort of a safety issue. So on the other hand, again, simply processing things at a fast rate doesn't translate into it, doesn't require all this machinery. So many a times, if it is simply a matter of sensor which is generating data at a very fast rate and all, that's easy to handle. You just, if nothing else, you can just keep moving to a faster hardware and you'll be done with it. With deadlines and all, as we saw, things get to be more complicated. You have to be able to make some promise. So next thing I wanted to do was to talk a little bit about the other type of scheduling that I mentioned earlier, but which I didn't. So thus far, with rate monotonic, deadline monotonic, and this whole framework, the assumption was that priorities are known upfront. They are static. They were changing only in a very limited fashion. Just to make sure you guys were listening. So in the discussion thus far, when were the priorities changing? Was there ever a situation where the priorities were not static? Come on, today's lecture. Did we talk about something where the priorities were changing? Yeah.
So for the priority ceiling.
For priority ceiling, exactly, right? There the priorities of a task were dependent upon the resource they were locking, right? But so in a very limited way, we did see priorities changing, but otherwise the model has been based upon our analysis and all, we kind of figure out a static priority and kind of assign that, right? So it was simple. The problem though is with all of that we also saw that we cannot fully utilize the processor. Last time around, we had seen these examples where processor utilization was less than 100%, but we could not meet the deadlines. Okay, so deadlines force us to use a processor of a higher capacity than simply rate would have argued for. Based upon rate alone, we can talk about utilization of a processor and then just pick that up, but deadline kind of forces us to use a higher priority, a higher capacity processor or higher capacity resource. So that leads to, so answer to this is dynamic priority scheduling. And in dynamic priority scheduling, the basic concept is now the OS decides the priorities based upon, it keeps changing it based upon some criterion, okay, based upon something about the deadlines. And one of the most used algorithms out here is the so-called earliest deadline first algorithm, or you could also call it as least time to go. Okay, and kind of intuitively the idea is at any given point in time in the system, I have a bunch of tasks which are ready to run. They are not blocked. And what I'll do is I'll give the CPU to that task whose deadline is the closest to the present time. Okay, and as you might see, this actually, depending upon which tasks are ready to go, the priority ordering can keep changing in this one. So priorities are inversely proportional to the absolute deadline. That is at what time according to wall clock do I need to finish. Okay. So what would happen is whenever some interesting thing happens, like a task finishes, a new task arrives, and so on and so forth, then I have to insert the task in the right place. So let's say an interrupt happened, the video frame arrived, the function corresponding to that now needs to be done. So I'll have to look into the queue and make an entry into this queue in the priority order according to this deadline. Okay, so I need priority queues. Those of you, it's a more complicated data structure than sort of what we needed previously. A perfectly equivalent in terms of its characteristic is an algorithm called least laxity first. And the idea in least laxity first is that we keep track of how much more computation time a task needs and how far away is its deadline. And then we look at the difference. And then we say the task which has the least laxity, which is the smallest difference between available time to its deadline and the processor time it needs, is the one which will have the highest priority. Again, kind of intuitively, both of these things seem to make sense. And both of them have the same property. So EDF and LLF. Okay. Now these things, EDF and they're harder to implement, so they're much rarer to find. But there are operating systems, RTOSs, which have them, but they tend to be more boutique OSs. Although some of it is changing, you'll find EDF and all much more commonly on like network routers and things like that, where utilization, as we'll see, EDF has a very nice property about utilization. Utilization is a lot more important. You will not find them in normal operating systems on CPUs. So specifically then what we are talking about is preemptive EDF. And so the idea is that anything that happens, an event arrives or a task does something which causes us to decide who next to run, we basically do that. If currently a task is running and interrupt arrives, that interrupt activates a task whose deadline is now closer than the one which was currently running, then we are going to preempt this thing out. Okay. That's the concept of preemptive EDF. Now, preemptive EDF has a very nice property. Property number one, it is optimum among all preemptive scheduling algorithms. That is, if you think of the category of algorithms that are preemptive algorithms, where the OS is allowed to preempt, okay, then it turns out that if EDF cannot do it, then nothing else can do it. Okay, so preemptive EDF is optimum, and we'll see next bullet why it is so. It turns out that preemptive EDF is optimum both for task sets where tasks are periodic. The model we have had thus far, I give you a bunch of tasks with periods and computation time, and I say, would it work irrespective of their phases, irrespective of the arrival of the first one? Or alternatively, I give you a bunch of tasks, and I just say, these tasks are going to arrive just once, and I tell you when they arrive. Okay, so I say, I have 5 tasks, task 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they just come once, and task 1 comes at 4 seconds, task 2 comes at whatever, t = 5, and so on and so forth, and I have some deadline. And again, I say, what's the best you can do if you were to be allowed preemption? Again, preemptive EDF is optimum. Now, for the periodic case, and where relative deadlines are equal to period, okay, in that case, EDF schedulability is equivalent to saying that total utilization is less than equal to 1. Okay, so let me frame it. I give you a bunch of tasks. For each one of them, I give you a period. I give you how much CPU time they need each time they arrive. And I also tell you that their deadline is equal to their relative deadline is equal to the period. So if a task arrives at t = 5 and its period is 10, then it must finish by t = 15. Under that setting, the test for schedulability, that is, would EDF work or not, is simply saying that does the total fraction of the CPU those tasks need, is it less than equal to 1? And this is why it is optimum, because it cannot be greater than 1, because that means I need that I'm overutilizing the processor. So basically, in this case of deadline equal to period, periodic task, EDF is optimum, because obviously if EDF cannot do it, then nothing else can. If deadline is less than period, then I can artificially, then I would have to do some additional tests. If deadline was more than period, then I could artificially treat the deadline to be equal to the period and apply this test. Uh, main result is that this is a proof. I'm going to skip the proof. The main result basically, yeah, I'm skipping the proof. The main result is that just ignore all of this for the moment. Main result is that if that the total processor utilization, that is sum of the fraction of the CPU that each task takes, should be less than equal to 1. If I have multiple cores, then this less than equal to 1 will change. If I have k cores, then I will say less than equal to k, provided all the cores were being managed as one collective. If I slow down the CPU, then all the C's will proportionately change. So again, at the new CPU speed, I'll have to worry about it. So with EDF, it also becomes very easy to figure out how fast a CPU I need. I calculate the processor utilization, the left term. If it is 0.8, that means I can slow the CPU down by 20%. So it's very easy to deal with slow down in those kind of factors. What problems do you see with EDF? I mean, I said it's rarely found, so why do you think that's the case?
Doesn't take priority into account.
Who cares? I'm meeting the deadlines.
You have to have probably some way of approximating what the deadlines of things are in the future, or it'd be difficult to actually implement that.
Yeah, and why? Why? You're on the right point. So the main thing is the OS has to do a lot more work, because the priorities are dynamic. We already saw priority queue emerging into picture. We also have to keep track of the actual real deadline for each instance of the task. So all those things require more bookkeeping. Okay, so that becomes an issue. So the need or desire for having EDF has always been there, because it's so much better. But the complexity is what kind of prevents it. But again, places where that loss of utilization is quite critical, there it becomes important. So like I said, in network routers and all, they end up using in the high-end stuff, they use it because if you're losing 20-30% of your bandwidth, that's a lot of money. Whereas in processors, we tend to care a lot less about over provisioning in this particular way. On the other hand, if you are if you are a provider like Amazon Elastic Services and all, then you do care about utilization of your CPU. But then usually those people are not in the business of deadlines and real timeliness. They only care about the rate. If you have a system where only rate matters and you do not, to the first order, care about deadlines, then the scheduling is very easy, right? I mean, you basically just keep the processor full. Things like Linux or Windows, they optimize for keeping the processor busy while being fair. So they have a very loose requirement. But the moment deadline enters into picture, things get complicated. Okay, so let's see. Do I want to go over this thing? Not really. yeah, I want to skip this part. Um, so comparison of the slides that I've skipped over basically go into for the case where deadline is not equal to period, what one can do. Okay, so there's some theory around that also, but so rate monotonic or fixed priority versus EDF. Main advantage of fixed priority is that it's a lot easier to implement. I have a queue, a new task arrives, I just put it in the back. I basically don't care about the ordering. Okay. If I have multiple priority levels, then I'll have multiple slots, one for each priority level. On a deadline driven solution, I will have to maintain some sort of priority queue to work these things out. Now, at the same time, one should also recognize that if your system has relatively few tasks, like you're designing an application specific system, just ECU in a car, maybe 10 tasks or something like that, then the difference between EDF and rate monotonic is not all that great. Not these issues that I have a priority queue and all becomes an important issue only if I have a lot of tasks. Then I need a complicated data structure. If I have very few tasks, I can just do a brute force search, just time scan it across the queue. Just like we had priority inversion problem, there is an analogous thing in EDF which happens, which is a deadline interchange. And kind of the concept is the following, that in priority inversion, what was happening was a task had locked a resource which a higher priority guy needed. In this case, what will happen is a task has locked the resource which a task whose deadline is very close needs. Okay, so the idea then would be temporarily we will let this task whose deadline is further out but who has a resource give it a higher priority. So same kind of concept happens. So in this particular case, so you have to deal with the same set of issues. Dynamic priority has significant advantages. One is the simplicity of the schedulability test, sigma u less than equal to 1. So that was great. Although once the deadline is not equal to period, things get more complicated, but still better. EDF is fully able to make use of the processor, so you basically are not leaving the hardware underutilized. Okay, so from a power perspective, it is great. From a cost perspective, it is great. Let's see. EDF also has a very interesting property that as the available capacity goes down, then all the tasks are treated fairly. Okay, so what I mean by that is they all will miss their deadlines with equal likelihood. Okay, so a gradual slowdown, maybe because thermal event frequency is going down, or maybe some other thing which happened, or maybe just I have a cheaper processor, the whole system degrades more gracefully. Whereas in rate monotonic, suddenly my lower priority tasks start missing the deadline. So that kind of becomes a problem. So EDF, lots of interesting advantages and all. There's a key theorem which basically essentially makes this point that there's a graceful degradation that happens. Okay. Some other issues which come up, which we haven't talked about explicitly, but just wanted to give you a quick taste of some of those things. Okay, so one issue which happens in real life a lot is that my tasks not only share resources, they also have dependencies. What I mean by that is I may have a situation like the following, ignore the left side, that task 1 produces some data which task 2 needs. So what may happen is that right now, until now, our model was a bunch of tasks, they arrive based upon some external event, so they are arriving periodically. But oftentimes what happens is my video frame may arrive periodically, so task 1 is triggered periodically, but task 1 produces a result which T2 and T3 need. T2 in turn produces a result. So it could be that task 1 is some sort of a reader task. Then it forwards the video frame, the image frame to T2 and T3. Maybe one of them is doing some edge detection, maybe the other guy is doing something else. So usually that initial processing task then results in a bunch of downstream tasks. Now let's look at like T2 and T3 and all. Okay, the problem out here is that they depend upon the data arriving from T1. So even though T1 was periodic and may have a computation time and all, when it produces the result is what dictates T2's arrival. And situation is even more complicated because T1 may take different amounts of time every time T1 runs. So when T2 gets invoked, so there are two issues: may not be periodic, and the second thing is that it has to wait for T1. So more generally, then our systems look like as if they have a bunch of clusters of such connected such graphs. Okay, so I may have kind of bunch of root tasks which may arrive, and then they result in a bunch of whole bunch of downstream tasks being triggered from it. Somehow this dependency needs to be kept track of. So that's problem number one. I'm going to skip the solution out here. Another problem that happens is the following. That what happens under the situation where there is a large discrepancy between worst case and average case performance. So let me describe that. I may have a task which, depending upon the input it sees, can take a lot of time. So its worst case execution time is really large. But most of the time it takes relatively little time. Okay, so it's best average case is okay, and we find such tasks all the time. So the situation that we have is that worst case execution time is much greater than mean execution time. Now, the approaches that we discussed thus far, we always said let's design for the worst case execution time. The problem with that is that we end up with a very conservative design. So how can we make use of that? One possibility is that we let our processor do something else, so maybe some background tasks and all. But there is another approach which is used, and this goes under a variety of names. It's called approximate computing, imprecise computation, things like that. But the basic idea is the following, that for these tasks, which depending upon data may take a very bad worst case time, but average case is pretty good, what we'll do is we'll create an alternative version of those tasks. And that alternative version is going to be designed so that its worst case execution time is small, but it comes at the cost of a poorer result. Okay, so it could be that maybe it's numerically imprecise, maybe it does less search. So it's upper bounded, so its worst case execution time is great, but its quality of result is poorer. So let's see how that can play out. So I have some computation to do, and I have my primary implementation, and this primary implementation, both of the period of the task is 15. On an average, it takes 7 time units, but it can take as bad as 20 time units. And then I have a second implementation, which is poorer quality. It's approximate, and its average case is 4, and its worst case is 5. So the idea is, ideally, if the system could, I would like to do the primary version because it's a high quality implementation. But I would rather not miss the deadline. So if there's a chance that I could start missing the deadline, then I would switch to the alternative. Now in this particular case, if you notice, period is 15. So clearly I cannot do the primary in the worst case because the worst case is 20. So my strategy would be that I'll start out with the primary, and the moment I realize that running the primary is going to miss the deadline, I'm going to switch to the alternative. Now there are so a couple of ways of doing it. One is that maybe looking at the data can tell me whether I should use the primary version or the alternative version. Maybe something on the data tells me that. So that would be the easy case. But generally, I don't know that relationship. So what would your strategy be with something like this? So let's say this task arrived, you started running, you don't want to miss the deadline, but you also want to run the high quality version, the primary version as possible. So what strategy would you use? looking at these. So again, your goal is not to miss the deadline, but as much as possible, you want to run the primary version. You want to get the result of the primary version. So what's the point of no return for me in this case? Nothing deep here. So I have to finish by t equal to 15. Okay, task arrived. Which task should I run? Should I just be conservative, run the alternative one, which is guaranteed to finish before 15? Or should I take a chance and start on the primary? And if I start on the primary, at what time I should say, hey, it's too risky, let's switch to alternative.
Let's start with the primary and then at time 10.
At time 10, you switch over, right? I mean, because worst case, this guy is 5, which means I have to 15 minus 5, 10. That's the point of no return, because at that point in time, if I wait any more, maybe this was indeed the one which would have taken more than 15 and I would be in a problem thing. So the strategy here would be up to t equal to 10, I run the primary version, and if it doesn't work, then if I'm still going, then I say, hey, let's switch over, let's play it safe. So that I'm guaranteed to meet. So this is the strategy you could use. More generally, and this is actually an area of computer science which is currently quite hot, and then like lots of groups are pursuing it now. It's something called approximate computing, and kind of the idea is under approximate computing is that there are many algorithms where I can play this kind of quality trade-off. Remember, so here the trade-off was I said, to the extent possible, I want the high quality result, but I don't want to miss the deadline, so I give you this backup implementation. But you can lead this thing into a broader thing that there are lots of algorithms which have a natural tunability. Like, for example, let's say I'm computing pi, and you give me more time, I can give you more digits after a decimal point. You give me less time, I'll give you a poorer quality result. So depending upon how much time the CPU is willing, the OS is willing to give me, I can do a better job or a worse job. Can you think of some other examples like that where there is a natural thing about I give more time, I get a better quality result?
Perhaps like buffering a video into the stream or something?
No. Why do you put that into this category?
Because you could spend more time buffering the video than to get a better quality image, or you could output it quicker, but at lower resolution.
But I mean, buffering to the first order doesn't use the CPU time, so it's more of a memory issue there. Okay.
During digital signal processing of any kind, you can use just, a couple of the coefficients or
More coefficients, okay, great example. So I want to do filtering, I can use a filter with more coefficients and get a tighter cutoff of the frequency versus not. Okay, what else?
Perhaps triangulation, so the more time that you have to actually.
Okay, so I use more satellites on the GPS thing, for example, I get a better accuracy result. Search of any form, right? I mean, Google search gives me gazillion results. If it gave me half of that, I wouldn't notice, right? So search kind of things fall into that category. Number of bits used in signal processing. So I can do a quicker result using integer arithmetic. You give me more time, I can do floating point arithmetic. I can use double precision arithmetic, right? I mean, so I could trade off in that direction. So lots of examples where there is a quality versus compute time trade-off. Sometimes it's very clean and like I can stop the thing at any point in time, just a very smooth relationship between time and quality. Sometimes, other times it's more kind of discrete, but kind of the basic concept holds true. So this leads to kind of another variant, and it's used in certain operating systems, particularly something called Linux RK out of CMU. And the model out here is that we think of tasks as ones where there is a mandatory part which we must do, and there is an optional part which we want to do as much as possible. So kind of the idea is that if the OS, if there's more spare capacity in the CPU, let's get a high quality result, but there is perhaps some baseline. So each task is composed into two portions, part one mandatory, part two optional, and moreover, the optional part has some sort of a relationship between the resource I give to it. So, so think of it this way: I have a task, and it needs a resource. The resource being CPU time, let's say, okay, or network bandwidth, or something like that. So, if I give it resource less than m, then task failed. So the reward is 0. If I give the resource which is more than m but less than some upper bound, then the reward increases with some monotonically non-decreasing function, let's say linear or something like that. Okay, so I give it more time, the quality improves. I use more coefficients, I have a better result. I use more bits, I have a better result. So something like that. And then usually in these systems there is some saturation point. If I give it too much resource, it doesn't help me. So there's probably going to be some upper bound beyond which the utilization is maxed out. So there's some sort of a utility curve. It starts out 0, increases, and then saturates. And then in this particular case, our real-time scheduling problem essentially becomes one of, I have a set of tasks, each one of them have this utility function. If it is a hard real-time task which has no laxity and all, then essentially it would be utility is 0 below and above m it is 1 or something like that. And then your goal now becomes scheduling things such that all tasks meet their minimum requirement and the overall utilization of the system is as high as possible, the satisfaction of the user. The problem in these systems that usually come, it's a very popular theoretical model, and also, as I said, available in at least one operating system. Usually the problem which comes up is we have no way of knowing what this R of X is. As in, when are we, how is the quality of the result improving with that? In some cases, it's very clear. Like, for example, someone mentioned the triangulation thing, right? Okay, so in that case, if I'm using the position to then target a weapon, you can directly relate it to the likelihood that I will hit the target, and then I'm okay. But in other cases, like I give more time to the JPEG processing, how does the quality of the image improve and how happier it makes the user is harder to quantify. Usually what is done, I mean, in some cases what they do is they show off these things to the user and they say, okay, what's your satisfaction? And then try to develop a curve for R of X, that is how much processing I did, what was the end result, how much happier the user was, or what was the performance of the application. In case of Google, how much effort they should put for each query before returning is kind of a complicated thing. There's a latency aspect. If it gives me more results but 5 seconds, I might be unhappier. If it gives me fewer results, very few results, and comes back within a millisecond, I might be unhappier also. There's some sweet spot which they try to figure out with user studies and all. So depending upon the system, you may have a easy time or hard time coming up with this function. But if you could, then the OS can kind of take advantage of that. So this is these are called iris tasks, increased rewards for increased service, or utility-based models. So this is another model which is used. Yet another issue is what happens if I have a real-time system running across a network. So thus far, implicitly, we had as if things were on a single CPU or on multiple cores, but they were really close to each other. So there was no issue about it. A very common situation is I have network of some sort. I have processors. Task may start out in one processor. A message may go over the network. It may arrive at another processor, and this network has delays, and those delays are highly variable. So there are. This is a very, very hard problem, and part of the problem is networks are, at least your usual networks like Ethernet and all, if you look at the delay, it's highly non-deterministic. But the other issue which comes up is how do I divide the end-to-end deadline? So think of it this way. I get an event on processor 1. Some processing gets done on processor 1. A message goes over the network. Let's say my network was entirely deterministic. Okay, I knew its delay. Then the packet reaches network processor 2. Subsequent processing happens, results come out. And usually I have a total deadline from the event to the final output. How should I divide it up? How much should processor 1 have and how much should processor 2 have? So if my end-to-end delay budget is 1 second, should I give half a second to each? Should I give 100 millisecond to one, 900 millisecond to the other? Those kind of questions. And again, an impossibly hard, intractable thing, how to divide this deadline. And then when you throw into the mix the role that the network plays and the jitter that it may have, it becomes extremely complicated. Now, it's becoming quite important because we have now control systems and all which are networked, or even within a car. You may have sensors, a car network, an actuator. How do I kind of divide things up? So this whole area of doing real-time stuff across a network of this nature becomes is gaining kind of a lot of attention. So I'm going to stop at this stage, and I'm going to next time a little bit of thing before I kind of wrap this discussion up. But we'll kind of basically look at how once you start looking at these kind of systems where things are distributed and all, we enter into weird things also. Like for example, I throw more hardware or faster hardware, and the system starts missing deadlines. So things tend to be somewhat counterintuitive when we are in this realm. So I'm going to stop here. Some of you came late, so again, one thing I had basically said was that if there is a piece of hardware that you need for your project and you haven't heard from me saying, hey, I have ordered it, then you need to tell me, and you guys need to tell me about the gimbal that you need. So if you could locate it, then I'll order it. Okay. Okay. So see you guys on Thursday.
Gimbal lens.
No, I know. I